Good evening, and welcome to the first of the substantive lectures in the Ohio and the World Ohio Bicentennial Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Richard Sisson. I'm the co-organizer of this along with my colleague. You can't hear. I see that, whoops, that's not the mic. Here's the mic. But I could see better. My age, that's a helpful thing. Can you hear this? Is that better? It's better. I'm a co-organizer with my distinguished colleague from the Department of History, Jeffrey Parker, of this series. The idea was Jeffrey's. And he got this idea after a lecture that he had given up at Ohio Northern University in Ada. And he was speaking with somebody there. They said, listen, what you should do is look at an Ohio Bicentennial barn on your way back to Columbus. And he says, I'll do that. As a matter of fact, he saw two. And as he saw these, he was inspired to think about, well, what is it that the university can do to be a part of the Bicentennial? And when he got back here, he contacted a number of people. I saw his email, and as I usually do, you know, when I see what looks like a great idea, I get excited and salivate uncontrollably, and got in touch with him, and we had a number of conversations, and we decided that it would be very important for the university to launch a series such as this. You can't do something of this sort without an enormous amount of help. And we put together an advisory committee, one member of which is going to be introducing our distinguished speaker tonight. And this committee helped us in refining the ideas of for the series. And also ways that we could engage with the Columbus Public Schools, how we would be able to organize things, lectures at other places around the state. It also takes funding, and the Ohio Bicentennial Commission was very kind to us, and we are very grateful to them, and to Steve George. I don't know if Steve's able to be here tonight, who is the executive director. The Ohio Humanities Council decided that instead of having their annual speaker, that they would join with us. We're co-sponsors and became a co-sponsor of the series, and they're essentially handling the lectures in other venues around the state. We also had support for our inaugural lecture from the Ohio Historical Society and the Columbus Dispatch. So we are very, very grateful to them. I know that Gail Peterson, the executive director of the Ohio Humanities Council, is here, and we thank you, Gail. And Gary Ness is here, executive director of the Ohio Historical Society, and we thank you, Gary. But we most certainly would not be here tonight were it not for the contributions from within the Ohio State University, from the College of Humanities, from the Department of History, from the Department of Political Science, from the Humanities Institute, from the Mershon Center. And we wouldn't even have gone to those agencies within the university had we not received a substantial funding from the Office of the Provost of the Ohio State University. And it's my pleasure to introduce him to you now, to tell you something about the university's role in embracing all of you here tonight and others around the state in prospect. Edward J. Ray. Ed Ray is a distinguished economist. He's had a distinguished career as an economist, has served as the executive vice president and the provost of the Ohio State University since 1998. He had some practice the year before in preparation for that position, but he had had an enormous amount of preparation because during his career as a productive academic professor, which is what universities are about, being productive academics, he had various leadership positions within the university. It's also fitting, given the subject tonight, that I observe, and I haven't asked him whether I should share this or not, but I remember this from a number of years ago, that the mother of his paternal grandmother was Cherokee. Ed Ray.
Anything else you want to know about my life, feel free to ask Dick. I think actually the real reason we're here tonight is because we have just an extraordinarily distinguished speaker in Professor Edmunds, who's here with us, and I don't want to delay the opportunity to hear from him any more than need be. But I do want to say a few things, as Dick indicated, and he said some of the things that I would have observed. But I want to welcome you to this, the first of the lectures on Ohio in the world to be held here on the Ohio State University campus. Ohio State, as Dick pointed out, is a co-sponsor of the series, and we're delighted to be working in partnership with the Ohio Bicentennial Commission and the Ohio Humanities Council, who serve as co-sponsors for this. This is an exciting way for the university to celebrate the state's bicentennial, to bring people together to discuss in a substantive way the history and the present and ultimately the future prospects of the peoples of Ohio, and how we got to where we are may in fact help inform our perspective about what's yet to come. So these early lectures set a foundation that I think will serve us very well as we go forward into subsequent lectures and discussions. The series, as your handouts indicate, includes some of the foremost thinkers and scholars who've worked in this area. One of the things that attracted me to supporting the lecture series was the extent to which it has a really fairly unique outreach dimension to it. From the very beginning, one of the major elements of this initiative that attracted my attention was to this remarkable series, and also, as Dick indicated, to provide some funding for my office. I get to go a lot of places by virtue of actually helping to fund things when I might not otherwise get invited, so I appreciate another opportunity to be part of a really exciting event. But part of what interested me was the fact that the lectures would be presented not only in Columbus, but at other important venues around the state as well, including Athens, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton, Newark, and Toledo. Here and there, our lecturers will be meeting with students and teachers from our public schools to discuss how they do their work. Professors Parker and Sisson are also offering two classes on the subject, one in the classroom and another version of the class on the internet, and I'm happy to note in these days of tight budgets that each is oversubscribed. This is the kind of intellectual outreach that great public universities can and must do. We're very proud to be doing it, and I want to say, and it can't be said too often or too loudly, how really proud I am of Dick Sisson and Jeffrey Parker for their vision and persistence in cobbling together many sources of funding to make this series a reality. The social, economic, political, and cultural development and history of our state will be examined through this series and interpreted in these lectures. The series acknowledges that the history of our state doesn't end in 2003. The last of the lectures will talk about what life might look like here in the year 2053. At the same time, the character of the state didn't begin in 1803 when the state was established, but in the engagements and contests for control of the land and the definition of its peoples in the mid and late 18th century. And thus, we're very proud to have tonight's lecture as part of that series. To introduce our distinguished guests, I'm delighted to call upon Dr. Lucy Murphy, Assistant Professor of History at Ohio State University, Newark. Dr. Murphy has been at Ohio State since 1999, and before that she was a member of the history faculty at DePaul University in Chicago and a National Endowment for the Humanities and Lloyd Lewis Fellow at the Newberry Library in Chicago. Her publications include A Gathering of Rivers, Indians, Métis, and Mining in the Western Great Lakes, 1737 to 1832, and other articles on Native American history, as well as an edited book on Midwestern women and articles on women entrepreneurs. Lucy?
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for the evening. To celebrate its 100th anniversary in 1995, the American Historical Review prepared an issue reviewing the progress of the major fields in American history over the past century, including articles by top scholars in each of those historical fields. It was natural for the review to turn to Professor R. David Edmunds to write its chapter on Native American history, as he has been a major contributor to this dynamic and growing scholarship since the early 1970s. The new Indian history, as Dave explains it, is, quote, designed to place Native Americans within the broader American perspective and illustrates how Native American people were motivated by their unique cultural patterns. Furthermore, he explains the new history attempts to present that experience from a Native point of view. Lured away from a high school teaching job in the late 1960s, Dave was attracted by the intellectual creativity of the 1960s and inspired by his family's Native background. He received a PhD from the University of Oklahoma in 1972 when the new Indian history was just emerging. Dave soon became a major contributor to that growth as a prolific scholar, writer, consultant, and professor. Dr. Edmunds is the Watson Professor of American History at the University of Texas at Dallas, having previously taught at Indiana University, Texas Christian University, and the University of Wyoming. He's written 6 books on Midwestern Native American history, including The Shawnee Prophet, Tecumseh and the Quest for Indian Leadership, The Potawatomis, Keepers of the Fire, and The Fox Wars, among others. There's a very nice display in the entryway, and I urge everyone to stop by. He has co-authored a forthcoming textbook on Native American history, which my students were pleased to preview last spring. Some of them are here tonight. He has edited 3 essay collections, including the forthcoming People of Persistence about Midwestern Native Americans as well. In addition, he's written more than 80 articles. And beyond his own scholarly research and writing, Dave has made major contributions in a wide range of efforts. He's presently president of the American Society of Ethnohistory, and I urge everyone to try to make one of those. They're a lot of fun, one of their conferences. He's actively planning for the next conference of the Western Historical Association next fall in Fort Worth. In addition, he's consulted on over 70 groups, projects, and organizations, including the Citizen Band Potawatomis, the Prairie Band Potawatomis, the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, and the Comanche Cultural Heritage Center. He has been called upon for help by PBS, the BBC, the Smithsonian Institution, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and by organizations as wide-ranging as the Indiana Historical Society, the Minority Achievement Program of the Association of American Colleges, and the National Cowboy Hall of Fame. That must have been a fun one. He has received numerous awards and honors. For example, his book, The Potawatomis, Keepers of the Fire, received the prestigious Francis Parkman Prize in American History. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Ford Fellowship, and multiple awards for excellence in teaching and research. The Citizen Band of Potawatomi Tribe made him an honorary tribal historian, and the American Indian Historians Association recently presented him the Award of Merit. In addition to all of these and many other impressive accomplishments, Dave is well known for his energy, his good humor, and his dedication both to American history and to Native American studies. Professor Edmunds' lecture this evening is entitled A German Chocolate Cake with White Coconut Icing, Ohio and the Native American World. Please help me to welcome Dave Edmunds.
Thank you. Does this pick me up at all? Okay. All right. Well, it's very much a pleasure to be here. I called Lucy the night before I left, and I used to live in Indiana, and I came back and spoke in Indianapolis about this time last year, I arrived as sleet and snow and everything else, and she said, "Oh my gosh, no, it's going to be 70," and I thought, "Oh, no, it's not. That can't be that." And it is, so I think I brought the Dallas weather with me, but anyway, it's good to be here. In the summer of 1765, George Crowan, a British trader and Indian agent from Pennsylvania, passed across southern Ohio on his way to meet with Indians in Illinois. He kept a lengthy journal of his trip and described Ohio as, quote, "a fine open country, a delightful prospect, on all sides level, rich and well watered, trees covered with grapevines. The soil on the banks of the Scioto for a vast distance up the country is prodigious rich. Buffaloes, bears, turkeys, with all other kinds of wild game are extremely plenty. A good hunter without much fatigue to himself could here supply daily 100 men with meat." Native American people undoubtedly agreed. From time immemorial, they had occupied the green hills and fertile valleys of the Ohio country. And some, such as the Shawanos, the Shawnees, the people of the South, considered the Ohio Valley to be the very center of the earth, the place created by the Master of Life for his people. This vast tract of land, stretching from the shores of Lake Erie in the north to the Ohio River on the south, and from the northward curve of the Ohio and its tributaries on the east to the watersheds of the Maumee and Great Miami on the west, would be the home for many Indian people who would, and still do, hold this land dear. Here they made their homes, and they erected their great earthen mounds, and they planted their cornfields. And here they fought, and they died in an attempt to keep Ohio Indian country. Now, this evening I would like to briefly discuss several facets of the Native American experience in Ohio and argue that a better understanding of these situations hopefully will provide an enhanced appreciation of the contribution that Indian people made not only to the history of this state, but also to the history of this nation. I'd like to spend a few minutes looking at Native American people in Ohio in the pre-Columbian period, when their contribution to Ohio history is Ohio history. And I also would like to argue that far from being a handful of wandering hunters and gatherers who scattered over the countryside shooting arrows at rabbits, Indian people in Ohio and elsewhere established sophisticated, complex societies, maintained extensive trade networks, and erected monumental public works. In other words, neither American history nor the history of Ohio begins in 1492. Indeed, in chronological terms, most of humankind's history in this state comes before that date. Now, tribal people's entrance into Ohio dates to the far distant past, at least 20,000 years ago. But by about 500 BC, people living within what archaeologists have labeled as the Adena culture were active in southern Ohio. Their settlements were centered along the Ohio and Scioto River and flourished between 600 BC and 300 AD. They represent the first mound-building societies to emerge in or occupy Ohio. The Adena people eventually were eclipsed by people living within another culture, which archaeologists have labeled as Hopewell. And the people who lived within this culture were partially emerged from the Adena and spread throughout much of the eastern United States. They flourished in Ohio from around 300 BC to about 550 AD. But like the Adena people, the Hopewellian people also were mound builders whose beautifully crafted flint and quartz blades, skillfully carved stone pipes, ceramic figurines, and beautifully fashioned, artistically fashioned implements and jewelry made from raw copper suggest a specialization of labor usually associated with settled, more sophisticated societies. These commodities were carried and exchanged over trade routes that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. and from the southern Appalachians as far west as Yellowstone Park. Although the Hopewellian people grew corn, it initially seems to have been used more for ceremonial purposes than as a staple of their diet. But they were able to sustain a series of population and ceremonial centers characterized by large earthen mounds, many of which served as places of internment. Moreover, archaeologists such as Bradley Lepper at Newark have suggested that the Hopewellian people also constructed roads which connected important ceremonial or political locations. Now, obviously, the construction of roads, large burial mounds, and other public monuments suggest a social political hierarchy and a degree of social control, which usually are associated with, quote, civilized societies, as does Serpent Mound, the 1/4 mile long urban effigy mound erected in modern Adams County. Archaeologists still argue over its origin, but there is strong evidence to indicate that it is of relatively recent construction in archaeological terms and represents an outpost of Mississippian culture which spread into Ohio from Cahokia, the walled Mississippian city located across the river from modern St. Louis. Flourishing in about 1100 AD, Cahokia and its suburbs encompassed a population of over 20,000 people. It included over 120 separate mounds, including Monk's Mound, the largest earth structure north of Mexico, broad plazas, markets, and temples. At Cahokia, the inner city was contained within an immense wall, palisade, complete with defensive towers and bastions, constructed of over 20,000 logs. The city's wall stretched for 2 miles, towered to 15 feet, and enclosed an inner core of about 400 acres. Archaeologists speculate that people living within the Fort Ancient complex in southern Ohio may have served as a distant satellite to Cahokia, supplying products from Ohio or from Iroquois-speaking people to the east. Well, enough of this archaeology then. So what? What does all of this have to do with Ohio and its people's place in the world? And the answer is quite a bit, I think. If we place Ohio's pre-Columbian people within a global context, they parallel the development of early, quote, civilized societies in Africa and Eurasia. Similar to emerging complex societies in Asia and Africa, the Adena, Hopewellian, and Mississippian people erected their towns and ceremonial centers along the banks of major river systems. While their Old World counterparts used the Tigris, Euphrates, Ganges, and the Nile, the ancient Americans utilized the Ohio, the Mississippi, and their tributaries. Many of these societies, in both the Old World and the New, erected great monuments to honor their gods or as resting places for their dead. The Egyptians built the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the temples at Karnak. The Assyrians built temples to Baal and Astarte, or a tomb for Sennacherib. The people of early Ohio, however, fashioned effigy mounds, mounds shaped after animals or birds, including an immense earthen serpent with an egg in its mouth, or they buried dead leaders surrounded by luxury goods in mounds whose construction required the labor of hundreds of individuals over extended periods of time. Moreover, emerging complex societies on both sides of the Atlantic seem to have been ruled by priest kings, whose political authority probably was vested in their combination of church and state. Now granted, the Adena, the Hopewellian and Mississippian peoples did not expand their political dominion into empires similar to the political entities in Egypt, Rome, or the Fertile Crescent. But the Hopewellian people, and certainly the Mississippians, formed virtual city-states that dominated local regions and brought neighboring people under their influence and hegemony. And as the walls of Cahokia and Fort Ancient illustrate, they too were forced to defend their treasures and resources from American Goths or Gauls or barbarians. And finally, like the early cultures of Egypt, the Mediterranean, or the Middle East, the complex societies of pre-Columbian Ohio also emerged, and they flourished for hundreds of years, and they eventually declined. Now, the main point is that far from being an isolated backwater, both Ohio and the larger region that would become the United States participated in a worldwide pattern of human existence and cultural development. Native American people both shared in and contributed to that pattern. If such was the case, if these societies were so sophisticated and successful, then why am I standing here speaking in English rather than in Shawnee or one of the Siouan languages? What happened to the Mississippians and their descendants? Why is the dominant culture of modern Ohio and the United States a European society that has been transplanted from across the Atlantic? Well, there are many factors to account for these, not the least of which was the Native American susceptibility to Old World diseases and the European superiority in metallurgy and armaments, combined with the Europeans' hierarchical political systems. But that is the subject of another lecture, which I'm sure you'll be pleased to forgo. Instead, I'd like to spend the rest of my time with you this evening discussing why Ohio and its peoples were so important during the colonial period and in the decade following the American Revolution. During these eras, during the period of the American the decade of the Revolutionary War and even before that, the future of both Ohio and the new American nation hung in the balance. And in both cases, it was Native American people in Ohio who had the power to tip the scales. Ironically, however, during the latter half of the 17th century, when European influence began to permeate the Ohio country, the region in the latter half of the 17th century, the late 1600s, was devoid of most of its Native American population. Well armed by Dutch and British traders, between 1647 and 1684, the Iroquois expanded westward out of New York, seeking to dominate the fur trade and bring the Midwestern tribes under their control. In the 1650s, Iroquois warriors overwhelmed the Eries, a little-known tribe living along the southern shores of the lake that bears their names. And following the Erie's dispersal, the Shawnees fled southern Ohio and sought refuge in the South or in Illinois. In a similar flight, the Miamis abandoned their ancestral homes in western Ohio and joined other refugees in Illinois or in the Green Bay, Fox River area of Wisconsin. Consequently, during much of the latter half of the 17th century, Ohio remained void of significant Indian population. We call this period the Great Dispersal. But the vacuum would not last for long. By 1700, the French and Western tribes had mounted a series of counter-campaigns and had pushed the Iroquois out of the western Great Lakes and the Wabash-Maumee watersheds. And in the 4 decades that followed, the Miamis reestablished themselves near French Post at Detroit, then scattered down the Maumee-Wabash portage, while Shawnees began to reoccupy the lower Scioto Valley. Meanwhile, Delaware villagers, uprooted from their homes in eastern Pennsylvania, spilled over the Appalachians and erected new towns downstream from the forks of the Ohio. The Delawares were formed by a new group, the Mingos, sometimes called the Ohio Iroquois, who were comprised of splinter groups from the Senecas, Cayugas, and refugees from other tribes. And these people occupied a series of small villages in eastern Ohio, stretching from the mouth of the Muskingum to the Cayuga Valley. Excuse me. American historians interested in this subject have often portrayed the first 2/3 of the 18th century, particularly the decades leading to the French and Indian War, as a monumental struggle between the British and French for control of North America. Within the broader realm of this contest, Native American people sometimes have been pictured as pawns in a diplomatic and military chess games, expendable pieces manipulated by colonial powers attempting to acquire allies and strategic locations to bolster their cause. But these erstwhile pawns, Indian people in Ohio, also formed grand strategies of their own. And if they were used by the Europeans, they also manipulated the people whom they called the men with hairy faces for their own ends. Ohio served as a focus of much of this activity. 1747, Ohio assumes central stage in this drama after a party of Hurons fleeing an intertribal dispute at Detroit relocated to the Sandusky Bay region. At Sandusky's, these Hurons killed several French traders and flirted with British traders out of Pennsylvania. The, quote, Huron revolt spread to the Maumee Valley, where the Miamis pillaged other French traders. And although the French were able to disperse the Hurons, by then known as Wyandots or Wyandots, or people of the opposite shore, at Sandusky, part of the dissident Miamis then formed a new village called Pickawillany at the juncture of Loramie's Creek and the Great Miami River near modern Piqua, Ohio. Now, these Miamis were led by a man called La Demoiselle, or the Dragonfly. He's sometimes also called Old Britain because of his close ties to the British. And they welcomed traders from Pennsylvania into the Ohio country and into their village. Their village soon became a center for British trade in western Ohio. And such a center that Indians from as far away as Illinois and Missouri journeyed there to gain access to British trade goods. Angered by the Miamis, the French reportedly ordered La Demoiselle and his followers to return to the Maumee, or the Wabash. But the Indians had an agenda of their own. By the 1750s, the Indian population in Ohio was comprised primarily of refugees. People had fled either the British control on the east or had moved back into the region to be free of French hegemony. They wanted access to European trade goods, but they wanted no part of European governments. At Pickawillany, La Demoiselle and his followers believed they were immune from French military power, yet accessible to British traders such as George Crowan and William Trent, who could reach their village from Pennsylvania. In eastern Ohio, Mingo, Shawnee, and Delaware tribespeople also had access to British trade goods, and they remained loosely allied with the colonial government of Pennsylvania. But they also functioned as autonomous communities, separated from both British control and the British settlers by the Appalachian Mountains. Moreover, these eastern Ohio tribespeople used the threat of possible ties with the French as a bargaining chip to protect their autonomy from Pennsylvania. Ironically, however, La Demoiselle's growing ties with British traders upset this balance. The French envisioned the Ohio Valley as a dagger poised at the soft underbelly of New France, particularly Illinois. If the British gained control of the upper Ohio, the river could serve as a penetration through which British influence and political power would reach the Illinois country and separate Louisiana from the western Great Lakes. They were aware that they could not compete with the British in terms of trade goods, but the French had military muscle to flex. First, in 1749, they dispatched Pierre-Joseph Céloron and about 265 men from Montreal to the upper Allegheny, then down the Ohio to the mouth of the Great Miami. As he goes down, he posts a series of copper signs on the trees of the Ohio in 1749, essentially saying posted, stay out English, posted. And as late as the early 19th century, somebody in Kentucky found one of these things still on a tree. It's remarkable. But it was an attempt to essentially keep the British from coming in. He went up the Miami River to Pickawillany and warned La Demoiselle that he should return to the Wabash. But the Miami chief was pretty ambiguous in his reply. He had as many fighting men as Céloron, and the Frenchman had to go back to Detroit without him. But Céloron's expedition illustrated that the French could put military power into western Ohio, and both the Miamis and the tribes in eastern Ohio sought assurances from Pennsylvania of military assistance. In response, however, the Quaker-dominated assembly in Pennsylvania sent goods and supplies, but opposed military alliances. They refused to dispatch any troops or build any military posts in the region. Now, into the void then steps Virginia. But the tribes in eastern Ohio were more wary of the Virginians than the French. The Ohio Company, operating out of Virginia, long had cast greedy eyes on the Ohio country, and Mingo, Delaware, and Shawnee people were aware of their land hunger. Unlike the Pennsylvanians, who had focused primarily on the fur trade, the Virginians, the Shamokaman, or the Long Knives, as the Shawnees called them, were known as land animals, eager to speculate in the upper Ohio Valley. And the Delawares had had earlier experience being pushed westward by the Englishmen before. Both the Shawnees and the Delawares disliked the Virginians, and by 1752, many Native Americans in eastern Ohio, formerly allied to the Pennsylvanians or the British, were moving back towards true neutrality. Now, events in western Ohio gave impetus to their decision. Angered over Ledemiso's refusal to return to Indiana, and by his continued ties to the Pennsylvania traders, in 1752, French officials dispatched a man known as Charles Langlade. He was a mixed-blood man, a Métis of Ottawa and French descent from the Michilimackinac area in Wisconsin, in Michigan. He led a large party of Ottawas, Chippewas, Potawatomis, and they attacked Pickawillany. They struck the village on June 21st, 1752, surprising the Miamis and the British traders who were there in their midst. Lord Demoiselle and his advisors and most of the British traders were captured or surrendered. Langlade ordered their execution. The village was burned, the Miami cornfields were destroyed, and most of the surviving Miamis then were forced to accompany the French back to the Maumee-Wabash waterway. Langlade's raid on Pickawillany did not end French efforts in the Ohio country. 1753, less than 1 year later, an expedition led by Paul Marin crossed over the Niagara portage and began the construction of a string of forts stretching towards the forks of the Ohio. Mingos in northeastern Ohio protested the French entrance into the region, but their kinsmen at Logstown and other villages downstream from the forks seemed less concerned about the French than the Virginians. And when Virginia sent a small detachment of militia to demand that the French return to Canada, the commander, a young Virginian named George Washington, received scant support from the tribes in eastern Ohio. So what's the significance of all this? Well, obviously both the British and the French regarded Ohio as a key region in their ongoing struggle for control of the American interior. And they probably envisioned the tribes as pawns in this contest. But the Miamis and the Wyandots and the Shawnees and the Mingos also manipulated the European powers in order to maintain both economic prosperity and political autonomy. Their ultimate failure during this late colonial period was not caused by any lack of sophistication, but by factors beyond their control. The tribes in eastern Ohio particularly continued to walk a tight wire between the British and the French throughout the French and Indian War, carefully assessing which side seemed to be preeminent and then supporting them. But they perceptively understood that the primary threat to their lands and autonomy came from neither of these European governments, but from British colonists. Ministers in Whitehall or Versailles would never spill onto their lands. Not so frontiersmen and land speculators from Virginia. Now, the extent of this threat became evident before Britain triumphed in the French and Indian War in 1763. Resentful of British colonists trespassing on their land, many Ohio tribesmen enlisted in the widespread Indian rebellion usually associated with Pontiac and Ottawa warrior Detroit. The revolt, which occurred in 1763, eventually failed. But ironically, the Ohio tribes still bore little ill will toward the British Indian Department. But in the decade following the Peace of Paris, as the British government and its American colonies moved towards war, the tribes grew even more hostile to American colonists. As Virginians spilled across the Appalachian into Kentucky and southeastern Ohio, the Shawnees particularly fought back. And although the Virginians won a temporary victory at the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774, the Shawnees were not defeated. They remained determined to defend their villages along the Scioto, and if they had reluctantly agreed that the Long Knives, the tribe's name for the Virginians, could cross onto their hunting lands in Kentucky, they envisioned this latter provision as only a temporary aberration. The Virginians would settle Kentucky at their own risk. There'd be little peace in the Ohio country. Not surprisingly then, when war between the king and the colonists erupted 2 years later, the Ohio tribes rallied to the British cause. They harbored no great love for the British, but they saw the conflict as an opportunity to reestablish a new balance of power between contesting groups of white men and to rid themselves of the Long Knives. In turn, British officials reminded them that the Crown had done its best to keep the colonists off tribal lands, even passing the proclamation of 1763 forbidding the colonists to cross beyond the crest of the Appalachians. The king's disobedient children, as they called the colonists, had defied their father and moved west on their own accord. Indeed, according to the British agents, the war had begun because the king had attempted to control and punish his unruly children, who now threatened the tribe's homelands. The Shawnees needed a little goading. In 1776, they and their allies from Ohio and Indiana fell upon the Kentucky settlements with a vengeance. And although the Long Knives took shelter in log stockades, war parties burned crops and killed or captured livestock. From the American perspective, things worsened in 1777, which is known as the Bloody Year in Kentucky, as war parties swept through the bluegrass region, preventing the settlers from planting or caring for crops. By the fall of 1777, the Kentuckians were reduced to living off game or what they could scrounge in the forests. In February of 1778, a Shawnee war party surprised and captured Daniel Boone and several other frontiersmen at a salt camp on the Licking River, carrying Boone back to the Shawnee village at Chillicothe. Now, as you all know, Boone later escaped and made his way back to Kentucky. But during the summer of 1778, the Shawnees besieged and nearly captured Boonesboro. The war temporarily turned in the American favor in 1778 after George Rogers Clark captured the Illinois country, and in 1779, John Bowman and the Kentucky militia raided into Ohio and attacked Chillicothe, but they were repulsed by the Shawnees after killing only 2 Indians. Ironically, 1778 and 1779 marked the high point of American success. For in 1780, the warfare in the West turned again in the Indian favor. 1780, Captain Henry Byrd led a British expedition from Detroit and assisted by Shawnees, Wyandots, and other tribesmen. They dragged a cannon from Detroit all the way across Ohio, constructed a raft and floated it across the Ohio River and wheeled it up to the forts in Kentucky. Now, it's one thing if you're in a frontier fort to stand over the walls and shoot back at Indian people who are shooting at you. It's something entirely different when they bring a cannon out and blow the fort's walls down. Actually, he was almost too successful. 2 forts went under immediately, and Byrd obtained so many prisoners, he eventually had to retreat back to Ohio. He had so many prisoners, he really couldn't conduct his raid. George Rogers Clark returned from Illinois to organize a new defense and found the Kentuckians so demoralized that he was forced to start drafting people to build an expedition to follow in Byrd's wake. And now, I have no intention of chronicling all the events that took place in the Ohio country during the Revolution, but suffice it to say that for the remaining 3 years between 1780 and 1783, the Indians and their British allies remained on the offensive and generally carried the war to the Americans. Indeed, During the 7 years of the American Revolution, the Americans remained on the defensive except for 2 years, 1778 and 1779. And when the war ended, Ohio remained Indian country, while those Kentuckians who had not fled back across the mountains to Virginia continued to huddle in their log forts, subsisting on game and what they could gather in the forest. So in retrospect, and this is the important point, in this case, the Native Americans and the British won the Revolutionary War in Ohio. They had carried the war to their enemies, had forced many to abandon their homes in Kentucky, and had prevented any American settlement north of the Ohio River. The Shawnees, the Wyandots, and other Ohio tribes did not see themselves as losers in this contest, and their assumption of success would have a profound impact on what happened in Ohio in the decade following the war. Because the new American government obviously disagreed, and their grandiose plans for the Ohio country set the bloodiest chapter in the history of Indian white warfare in all, not of Ohio history, but in all of American history. In the Anglo-American treaty that ended the war, the British ceded political title to almost all the territory, including Ohio, east of the Mississippi, to the new United States. The Americans assumed that this political cessation included the very ownership of the land itself. In other words, we as a country are now taking control, but we also own the land. And that the British government, not the tribes, actually had owned Ohio. Now, in response, the tribes literally were dumbfounded. First of all, from their perspective, they had won, not lost the war, and the Americans were in no position to dictate terms to them. Secondly, the tribes strongly asserted they had never ceded control of their lands to anyone, not the French, nor the British, and therefore the latter could not hand title of Ohio over to the Americans. And finally, when they questioned British agents about the treaty, the agents assured them that their father, the British king, might have temporarily relinquished his political control over the region, but the royal government would have never claimed their lands and would have never given their lands up to the Americans. This final assertion, of course, was predicated on the British belief that the new American nation wasn't going to last anyway, and that they were going to be back in there, and that they should do whatever they could to keep control of it. Such an assumption also emboldened the British to retain forts at Detroit and Michilimackinac, posts to facilitate their reconquest of the regions and their continued control of the fur trade. But the Americans needed the land in Ohio. During the war, they had run out of money. They had deferred paying the Continental Army. The soldiers had not been paid their wages. And they hoped to pay off this debt, the government hoped to pay off this debt by providing the soldiers with military bounty lands in Ohio. In other words, we owe you 3 years' wages, we can't afford to pay you, we don't have anything in the treasury, how would you like to have 1,000 acres of Ohio? Now, moreover, in the post-revolutionary period, many influential men in the new government dabbled in Western land speculation, and Ohio seemed to offer excellent opportunities. Between 1784 and 1789, therefore, the government officials attempted to gain Indian acquiescence to American claims of the region. They achieved little success. In 1784, at the Second Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the Iroquois gave up their lands in the region, but since they really owned no lands in Ohio, it didn't make any difference. 1 year later at Fort McIntosh, intoxicated delegates from the Wyandots, Delawares, and Detroit tribes also gave up their claims to part of the state, but the vast majority of their tribes denounced the treaty signatories and refused to abide by them. In 1786 at Fort Finney, a few Shawnees also agreed to a land cession, but most residents of the Ohio Valley, both Indian and white, believed that this treaty had little meaning. And finally, by 1789, the federal agents were willing to agree to the Native American position that, yes, the tribes did own the soil, but they asserted they would have to sell it to the government. When Indian agents then informed the Shawnees that they wanted tribal leaders to meet with them on the Muskingum so that officials could purchase the tribe's lands, the Shawnees told them flat out that if federal agents dared to appear at the designated treaty location, they would kill them. Officials wisely then decided to hold the negotiations within the more friendly confines of Fort Harmar, where a handful of Wyandots and Shawnees and members of several Michigan tribes signed a treaty relinquishing lands in Ohio. But the Shawnees, the Miamis, and other Ohio tribes didn't show up, declared the treaty invalid, and even George Morgan, who was an American Indian agent at this treaty, in his own words declared, quote, "Few of the natives attended this treaty and none were fully represented. Here the treaty was negotiated and speeches and explanations to the Indians made by our superintendent in the French language through a Canadian interpreter who has to guess at his meanings, for he can neither speak nor write the language as to make himself understood in any matter of importance." So we have another treaty here which is a very questionable treaty. It did not solve the problem. During the late 1780s, as American settlers attempted to settle lands north of the Ohio, the Shawnees, the Miamis, other tribes burned cabins, stole livestock, and took both scalps and prisoners. Flatboats descending the Ohio were ambushed, and those settlers who managed to survive north of the river were kept under an almost constant state of siege. Expeditions from Kentucky attacked Shawnee villages along the Mad River, but succeeded only in killing the few members of the tribe who previously had befriended the Long Knives. In response, Shawnee raids increased. Now, convinced then that the carrot of cooperation hadn't worked, the federal government decided to use the stick. In 1790, General Josiah Harmar and about 1,400 men left Fort Washington at modern Cincinnati and marched north towards the Indian towns along the Maumee. They reached the Fort Wayne region in mid-October before being twice ambushed by large parties of Miamis, Wyandots, Potawatomis, and Shawnees, then withdrew back to Cincinnati. Harmar lost over 180 men. Indian losses in these battles were minimal. 1 year later, Arthur St. Clair, the governor of the Northwest Territory, tried his luck. The result was even more disastrous. He also proceeded north from Fort Washington, and on November the 4th, 1791, he had reached the headwaters of the Wabash in modern Mercer County, Ohio, where early in the morning his camp was surrounded and attacked by an immense war party of almost 1,000 Indians. The battle raged from about dawn until 10 in the morning, when St. Clair and the American survivors broke through the Indian lines and fled for their lives. Some of the militia who escaped with St. Clair ran so fast that within 24 hours they had covered the same distance it had taken them 7 days to march prior to getting to the battle. This was not a retreat. This was just a mad dash for life, limb, and what else you could carry. Interestingly enough, I was talking to a group of high school students about this. Interestingly enough, St. Clair started out with about 2,100 men. He had about 700 desert before he got there. But in addition, this expedition started in Newport, Kentucky. Okay, and have you ever been lived in Cincinnati? Newport's hadn't changed much. It was full of somebody here's from Newport. I'm really in bad shape here. And it has a reputation of being a kind of a wide open town. And it had a lot of people who went along with it, etc. All right, well, make a long story short, as St. Clair went north, he was accompanied by large numbers of women who were listed as laundresses and cooks, and who probably had other occupations, okay? When this attack takes place, they are incensed that the militia is not fighting. And so St. Clair's baggage is right in the middle of his encampment. And the militia tried to hide under the baggage wagons, and these women picked up the campfires and threw them under the wagon to get the militia out, and the wagons caught on fire. And so some of the stiffest resistance put up here by the regulars, are some of these women who fought really well. The militia ran Of the people who were involved in the battle on the American side, St. Clair, and we're not exactly sure because we're not exactly how many deserted en route, but he lost at least 630 killed, 232 wounded. Almost one half of the standing army of the United States suffered a casualty in this particular one encounter. The women and children losses, we don't really know. All right. This is the largest single loss of life ever sustained by the United States Army in its warfare with Native Americans. It happens here in Ohio. We talk about the Little Bighorn and Custer, etc., but this is where the important ones are. Indian morale soared. Encouraged by the tribal victories, the British erected a new post, Fort Miami, just upstream from modern Toledo. The British also offered, to the Americans' great annoyance, to assist the United States negotiate a permanent autonomous Indian state north of the Ohio. Meanwhile, renewed American attempts to negotiate a peace treaty were spurned by the tribesmen who believed that they now held the upper hand. In 1794, when American agents offered to pick up the government's claims and to give up the government's claims to almost all of Ohio, except for those lands east of the Muskingum, an area already settled by American citizens, and to pay the tribes a large amount of cash, tribal spokesmen replied that the government should use the money to pay all settlers to leave Ohio, since it would be cheaper than raising and equipping another expedition. Well, in retrospect then, by 1793, the fate of the Ohio country hung in the balance. Encouraged by the British and by their recent victories, the tribespeople felt they could hold the region. Once again, by balancing one group of white men against the other, by receiving help from the British, they hoped to preserve their homeland and their autonomy. But like La Demoiselle at Pickawillany, and those warriors who had been allied with the Redcoats during the Revolution, they overestimated the depth of the British commitment. Although local British Indian agents had assured them that their British father would never again forget his red children, Britain was much involved in an ongoing struggle against post-revolutionary France. She did not want an additional conflict with the Americans. During 1793, Anthony Wayne rebuilt the American army in the West. And in 1794, he also marched north towards the tribal villages now clumped along the Maumee and Auglaize rivers. An ill-advised and untimely attack by the Indians against Fort Recovery, built near the site of St. Clair's debacle, split the Indian ranks. And when Wayne reached the Maumee in August 1794, the tribes had quarreled among themselves, and many of the Shawnees' allies had abandoned them. Still, the tribal defenders of Ohio believed they could turn back the Americans at Fallen Timbers, where a tornado had felled a grove of trees just upstream from Fort Miami, the newly erected British fort near modern Toledo. But as we all are well aware, Wayne's well-disciplined army carried the day, and when the warriors withdrew to the fort intending to make another stand behind the palisades, the British commander refused them entry. As Tecumseh, the renowned Shawnee war chief, later stated, "The gates were shut fast against us." Again, the Crown had misled them, and demoralized, the warriors retreated into Michigan, Indiana, or east along the shores of Lake Erie, while Wayne burned their towns and cornfields. 3 months later, in November 1794, American and British representatives signed Jay's Treaty, in which the British agreed to relinquish all their western posts and honor their pledge to withdraw to Canada. Defeated, less than 1 year later, the Ohio tribes signed the Treaty of Greenville, ceding all of Ohio but the northwest quadrant to the United States. Now, led by Tecumseh and the Shawnee Prophet 2 decades later, tribes would ally themselves again with the British and make a final desperate stand. By then, they were so outnumbered that the outcome was a foregone conclusion. The battle was lost. Ohio was no longer Indian country. So let's return again to some of the questions with which I started. How strongly did Ohioans identify with the state? What does the state mean to its citizens? How has the war shaped Ohio? And what role did the state play in American history? And the answer seems to me are obvious. For the native people who lived in the Ohio country, the first Ohioans, the region was everything. As stated previously, the Shawnees believed the Ohio Valley was the center of the earth, and that the rest of the earth radiated out from it. They took their identity from their homelands, and they were willing to die to defend it. Like other tribal people in the region, they attempted to walk a fine line between contesting European or American governments who also laid claim to the region. But like many of you in this audience who have lived all of your lives in this region and whose parents lived here before you, they envisioned this region as their home. They too were Ohioans, or Buckeyes, I guess, but their connection to the land itself transcended what most Americans feel for the region in which they live. They took their very identity from this region. The descendants of the Shawnees who still reside in this state and who continue to identify themselves as Shawnee people still do. Were they and the Europeans and the state itself shaped by warfare? And tragically, I think the answer is yes. Ohio was and is a very rich, fertile, and strategic region in the heartland of America. Blood was spilled to both conquer and defend it, and let's hope that such bloodshed will remain a thing of the past. So in conclusion, let me reiterate that Native American people have both shaped and shared in the history of Ohio and in the history of the United States. Too often we envision American history as primarily the history of Europeans. American history is the history of white people. Yet if we look at the broader span of both the history of Ohio and the history of the United States, particularly the history of the pre-Columbian period through the 18th century, many of us have been putting our emphasis in the wrong place. In retrospect, the entire span of American history is not a white cake with considerable marbling in its most recent layer. Indeed, in chronological terms, American history is instead a rich, brown, multi-layered German chocolate cake with a white coconut icing. Thank you.
Good. I'm supposed to moderate.
Right in.
Okay, we're going to take some questions. Before we do, I have a couple of announcements to make. There's a reception after the talk tonight, and we hope you'll all stay and chat and have some refreshments with us. Also wanted to announce that you're all invited to come to the Newark Earthworks tomorrow at 3 p.m. for a public tour. Please come to the Great Circle on Route 79 in Heath. And Dr. Edmunds will be there, a number of us will be there, and we'll be getting a guided tour by a number of experts if you'd like to learn more about ancient Ohio. You can get more information about the Newark Earthworks at the Ohio Historical Society's website. Now, I'm pleased to moderate a question-answer period, and I see a young man over here with a question for Professor Edmunds.
Sure. Just yell it out. Now, no one's ever accused me of not being able to hear me, so.
I'm pretty loud, too. I'm a part-time grad student here in the history department and a full-time high school government teacher.
Sure.
I was wondering if you could tell me, in your opinion, what's the greatest impact that Native Americans have had on our government? Or if I was to explain that to high school kids, how would I do that? In your opinion.
I think our government, there are a lot of people who among the Iroquois who would disagree with me because they make a strong argument that the Constitution was modeled after the Iroquois system. Quite frankly, I've been doing Native American history longer than I care to admit. I would love to stand up here before you and tell you that the American Constitution was modeled after the Iroquois system, but I think primarily the American Constitution was modeled pretty much after Enlightenment ideas. They knew about the Iroquois system. In terms of government, I think the contribution might be there much more minimal. The major contribution Native American people have made, not only in terms of that, and within the framework of the way you're asking the question, within the framework of both the United States and the world, is in terms of phenomenal contribution in terms of agriculture. So many, many foods, which we assume, Irish potatoes, for goodness sakes, come from the Americas. Peanuts, tomatoes, go right on down the line. Corn. The introduction of corn back into the Old World, for example, maize or corn as we call it, is really when we begin to see a burgeoning world population, because it fits into an agricultural niche which is too cold and dry for rice, but too warm and wet for wheat. So that lands that could not be put into production or can be put into production, more food, less famine. Less famine, more people. And of course, one of the major problems that faces the world today is basically the population explosion. Now, if you look at the demography of the world as well as we know it, we can see that it went up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down until the introduction of the American foods, and then it was whoop, whoop, whoop. So there's a wonderful book written on this by a man named Alfred Crosby, and it's called The Columbian Exchange. And he looks at what was the impact upon both societies when they interchanged. He also has some interesting things there on disease. The disease impact is also hard to overestimate. We would have said 30 years ago that the pre-Columbian population of the United States was about maybe 1.5 million, maybe a million, maybe less than a million. Two other guys and I are writing a textbook now from Native American history. We're pretty conservative right now, and we're saying, no, it's probably somewhere between 7 and 10 million. There are people that say, oh no, 15 to 18 million. I think that's probably a little large because they're looking primarily at Florida and California, which all the country wasn't, like it isn't now, isn't that full of people. But the point is the disease was catastrophic. Catastrophic. Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
No, you
go ahead, and then you can turn them over to me.
Yeah.
You inferred in your remarks at the beginning of your lecture that the Indian culture in the United States, the Native American culture in the United States, was at about the beginning of the AD period, was about as well developed as it was in other parts
Very similar.
of the world.
Yeah. Well, I think so, but it depends. Different areas of the world developed, different cultures developed in different ways. But if you look at we talk about the cradle of civilization in the Middle East, or we think of the early centers of civilization in the Old World, Egypt and the Fertile Crescent, Tigris and Euphrates rivers, of which we're learning a lot about here more recently. Other places, they tend to be very riverine. They're long rivers. They're characterized by sort of a combination of church and state, priest kings. They're also characterized by great monuments, pyramids, etc. You can say the same thing in Asia, along the Yangtze, along the Ganges, etc. The same thing happens over here. We just really have chosen to ignore it because most of our history it's been written from a European perspective, because basically that was the American perspective. And I think you can find many similarities, yeah. The major difference is in some ways no centralized political areas. In other words, we don't have great empires here, but we do have city-states. And Cahokia in 1100 is larger than London. It's larger than the cities in Western Europe almost. So it's an interesting when we think, well, that's just 20,000 people over, bigger than London in the year 1100. It was a walled city. So no written culture north of Mexico. Mexico had a wonderful written culture that was destroyed essentially by the priests accompanying the Spaniards, because their history and their literature was so interlaced with the religion that they felt it was pagan, and they basically did their very best to get rid of it. Mathematics and physics among the Mayan their astronomy was spectacular. Mayan mathematics was really good, and once again their astronomy was so accurate that they didn't have to adjust their calendar every 4 years for leap year. So yeah, there are some really it's very similar, but we tend to say really out of the mainstream, everything that really is happening, and no, it's just that we haven't really done it. I still teach the old freshman American history survey, where some of these guys, that people in here I'm sure are catching this right now maybe, or you all did if you went to college, and I in my American survey, the first couple of weeks almost, I talk about the pre-Columbian period. And students really like it because they haven't run into it before. Major complaint they have is, well, we saw this in junior high, we saw it in high school, here it comes again. Well, that's something they haven't seen.
There's a question back here. Yes?
Yes, my name is Catherine Perry. I'm a social studies teacher, and I would like to know your opinion of the 500 Nations book and video series, first of all. Second, I'd like to know what you would do differently were you to come
I wouldn't chase Rebecca Galloway. That's no. Which I don't think he did really, but that's all right. I think that the series is a good series. That's a good series. Incidentally, I might put a plug in for another series. There's a wonderful TV series on the History Channel called American Frontiers, which focuses upon Ohio. It focuses upon Pontiac. It focuses upon the Midwest and George Rogers Clark and Fallen Timbers. So in terms of that. You know, I think what happened, as some of you probably know, I wrote about Tecumseh after I wrote about his brother. I wrote about the Shawnee Prophet first, and I was writing a book on the Potawatomis, and I didn't really cover it coming to the War of 1812, and I thought, I am really interested in this now because I'm going to be able to write about Tecumseh and the Potawatomis reacting with Tecumseh. And I went back into the material, and there was nothing in there in the documents about Tecumseh. But it was Shawnee Prophet, Shawnee Prophet, Shawnee Prophet. I kept thinking, where's Tecumseh? Where's Tecumseh? He's not in here. Where is he? Where is he? And at the time, I was telling these other people earlier today, everybody will have one good idea in their life. That was probably mine. That was at about the time that the Ayatollah was coming to power in Iran. And most Americans kept saying, how can the Iranians be following this crazy religious leader? He doesn't make any sense, okay? And it dawned on me what was happening here in the Midwest was that it was the prophet who really was generating this, and it didn't make any sense within a European context. But what he had to say, if you go back and look at tribal religions, it made a lot of sense. And so Tecumseh then takes this religious movement and he transforms it. What would I have done differently? Oh, gosh, I might have started earlier. I don't really know. I mean, the problem is, I would think in all sincerity, Tecumseh and the prophet, I've written about him. I really admire Tecumseh. I'm afraid, though, boy, by that time, Britain was a declining power over here, and the problem for Native American people is in these contests, there's two or three. Number one is logistics. In terms of sustaining a long-term warfare, if you have to rely upon the other side to get your arms and ammunition, you're in bad shape. And if the British are gone or can't really do it, it puts you in bad shape. The other problem for Native American people politically is that tribal Native American political structure is basically diffused. By Tecumseh saying, I am going to unite all of the tribes, we are going to stand together, we will form a united front against the government, he's going against traditional Native American government forms. And many of the tribes resented this. They said, well, I'm the chief of the Miamis. Why is he taking Miami people away from my village? I'll tell you something which very few people know, and there were more Shawnees, this is an interesting fact, there were more Shawnees that fought with William Henry Harrison at the Battle of the Thames than fought with Tecumseh. That's surprising. Now, the interesting thing is, who do we remember from that era? Do we remember those Shawnees who capitulated? Nah. We remember Tecumseh. But I think also Tecumseh is such a remarkable man that he almost epitomizes what people would like Indian people to be. He's a remarkable man. I don't mean to demean him in there. I mean, we've made him into a legend, and he stands on his own. I mean, yes, sir. I'm sorry, Lucy. I'm usurping Lucy's position here. No, okay.
I do not need the authority.
Enjoyed the remarks, and I have a question. You chronicled that Native Americans had great success against the Long Knives.
In Kentucky, in the war, in the American Revolution, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
And
I could go on and on about that, but I'm...
so it seems that one battle, the battle of Fallen Timbers, just ended on that.
Yeah.
Why?
All right. There's...
After
All right.
such a record of success, why would
All,
it happen?
all right, there's several factors involved in that. Number one, Anthony Wayne built an entirely different kind of American army out here. Anthony Wayne's called Mad Anthony by his troops. He's not called Mad Anthony because he was such a warrior. He's called Mad Anthony because they thought he was completely nuts because he had such strict discipline. I mean, his men were disciplined. Under St. Clair and Harmer, they were not. If you went to sleep, if you were in Wayne's army and you went to sleep on your post, he branded you. So people didn't go to sleep. Secondly, the Indian ranks are split before this. There is an attack upon Fort Recovery as Wayne marches north. Unlike Harmer and St. Clair, who just go marching blithely north, Wayne marches, builds a supply post. Marches, builds a supply post. Marches, builds a supply post. They attacked one of the supply posts, and there was a big disagreement over who got the horses. The supply train was leaving, and part of the Tecumseh's allies went home. The Potawatomis and the Chippewas and the Ottawas said, well, we did the fighting, and the Delawares and the Shawnees got the horses. And so they went home. So the Native American ranks were lessened. The final thing was most of the tribes knew that the British had built the fort, and they assumed if they made a stand at Fallen Timbers, and if they retreated, that they could retreat back into the British post, because the British commanders of the British had assured them, oh yeah, well, if things don't work out here, fall back to the next position. They fell back, and when they got there, the British commander then would not let them in the post. And that was the icing on the cake. And then they essentially said, well, it's pretty obvious that this support is what it had been, unfortunately. Yes, sir.
Other subject, who are the ancestors of the Ohio?
Who are the ancestors of the people who live in Ohio, the Native American people? People who have lived in the New World at least 20,000 years. I personally believe that that people who we know as Native American or Indian are originally, the ancestors originally were probably out of Asia, but man, we've been here a long, long time. And and all of the evidence continues to place residency here further and further and further back. In fact, there's more evidence right now saying that, we used to say people had come across the land bridge in the last ice age. No, there's now evidence people came across much earlier than that. There's too much residency too far south in South America. Now, many Native American people will say, we originated here. We have always been here. And the problem is when you begin to look at origins like this, I think that the tribal origin stories are really valuable because it helps us understand how people see themselves. But I tend to believe in evolution rather than Adam and Eve, but a long-term residence. Up until 1927, 28, 29, most scholars, whoever that is, thought that Indian people had come over relatively recent. Then that was upset. But a long residency, I don't question that.
I hear a lot about the diseases of the Europeans ravaging the Native Americans. Were there no diseases among the Native Americans that had
Yeah, there was one. Although syphilis is closely related to yaws and some other African diseases. This is a controversial thing. Syphilis, as we understand it, I think, not that I have familiarity with it and don't want any, but the point is, seems to break out in Europe at about the time of Columbus's return. And it's in some ways, it's ironic, it seems to spread among the nobility faster than among the population in general. Also, the French call it the Italian disease, the Italian call it the French disease, the French call it Spanish disease. Nobody wants to take credit for it. But if I'm not mistaken, when Shakespeare is writing about the pox, etc., that's what he's writing about. He's not writing about smallpox. And the classic syphilitic in European history, the one that just stands out like a sore thumb, is, anybody know whom? Henry VIII. Oh yeah. all the problems with reproduction, et cetera? Yeah, seems to be. And anyway, yeah, which is an interesting factor, because if you introduce one of the side effects of syphilis, outside of dying and going mentally deficient, is sterility. And in a political system where power is transferred father to son, essentially, if someone becomes sterile, the king becomes sterile, then you have no heir. And we can go on and on and on. European historians know more about this than I do, but yes, sir.
Hi, yes, thank you. Little Turtle is a little reluctant to fight prior to Fallen Timber.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, after wonderful successes. Was that because, in your mind, that because of the Fort Recovery, guys want to go, was he
Yeah,
a little older?
Little Turtle is a Miami chief who had been responsible for at Harmer and Sinclair's defense. And yeah, I think he probably sees the handwriting on the wall. Little Turtle tries to get the other tribe to say, hey, look, we're not going to win this one. We better come to some terms. And so he does pull back as well. He's not upset over Fort Recovery. Little Turtle, from everything we know, and he survives the war afterwards, basically said, this is a losing battle. We're not going to win this. And we better make the best deal we can. And so I don't think you should, you can say, well, Little Turtle, he didn't turn tail then. He just basically said, this is one we're going to lose. And he pulled many of the Miamis out with him. Not all of them. Yes?
I got three questions, I mean, two of which we answered at once. One, I've heard of that battle with St. Clair in 1791, but I've never heard the name of the battle given to it, and I thought St. Clair was killed in that battle.
No, No, he makes it back. It's called St. Clair's defeat. I don't, basically is what it's called. Harmer's defeat, but yeah, he makes it back.
Okay.
It brings about a great congressional investigation, which we've been having ever since. But
And in high school history, I was taught like the main event of this period is like the Battle of Vincennes. That's the thing that's really important.
you mean during the American Revolution?
Yeah, because essentially the Indians, they were more advanced than we give them credit for, but that they were still nowhere even close to being able to fight with the Americans on equal ground because they had no logistics.
Well, the Vincennes thing is when George Rogers Clark crosses Illinois and seizes Vincennes and captures Henry Hamilton during the American Revolution. And in some ways, that's the high point of the during the Revolution, because in 1779, what happens then, ironically, is that the road to Detroit is open. The Kentuckians believe that all of the trouble they're having with Native Americans is because the British are egging them on. It's sort of like the diehard Southerners in the South during the Civil Rights era saying, well, it's those outside agitators that are stirring everybody up. And obviously it was not. The same thing here, they said, well, it's the British. If we get rid of the British, the Indians will never attack us. So they capture Henry Hamilton, who they call the hair buyer because they believe he's buying scalps. And George Rogers Clark then goes back to Kentucky and says, all right, the Wabash is open. All we've got to do is go up and seize Detroit, and we will have it. And the people in Kentucky say, well, we haven't got any crops in for 2 or 3 years, and if you've already got Hamilton, shoot, that's there's not going to be any more attacks. And so they have this really golden opportunity, and then they lose it. And it goes over to the British and Indians.
Why don't we call it a
Well, here's one more question. Then it's awfully warm in here. You guys are,
we could adjourn to have
for sticking this out is,
in the
all right.
in the refreshment
All right.
arena.
All
But
right.
do you want to take one
Sure.
more question?
Sure.
I've heard people talk about the Fallen Timbers being so pivotal, and that if it had succeeded, like if that tree had actually smashed one of you, and they couldn't succeed, that fortunately might have had to treat for an Indian population.
Well, the British tried to intervene. The British said to the Americans after St. Clair's defeat, listen, you're having trouble with those Indians, aren't you? How would you like for us to negotiate a little we'll serve as intermediaries with you, and we'll just set up sort of a buffer zone up there. It'll be kind of a semi-autonomous Indian state between Canada and the United States, and this will work out for everybody. And of course, the United States' response to that was what you might think, particularly since it was the British, of all people, who were not too popular in the United States in 1792 or 3. And the tribes probably were overconfident. But the Americans, in 1793, after they're beaten twice, sent emissaries to the Indians and said, literally, see what we've done? You want to negotiate now? And the tribe sent back a fascinating little reply saying, please let us know when you're coming again. We want to arm our women with switches. So it's obviously they were probably overconfident as well. Well, listen, thank you for coming. It's a very warm night in here.